Then There's California, a podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about their lives, their legislative priorities, policies, and other related issues that help make California exceptional. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. Mental health advocates in California have long been using some pretty grim descriptors to portray our state's fragmented mental and behavioral health system. Well, grim is one description they use, or struggling, or dysfunctional, or broken. California's mental health care challenges touch those living in upper and middle class suburbs, remote rural communities, and in our state's biggest cities. And the fallout and the real life impact of those challenges can be found in our correction systems, in our hospitals and clinics, on our school campuses, on our streets, and of course, in our own families. And not only do 1/6 of Californians experience some sort of mental illness, but 1 out of every 24 of us have a mental illness so serious it becomes difficult to function in daily life, and we're fundamentally unable to make decisions about our lives voluntarily. And the COVID pandemic of the past 2 years has drawn those statewide mental health care challenges into even sharper relief. Thanks to the voter-approved Mental Health Services Act, passed in 2004, which funneled more than $2 billion in taxes into the state's behavioral health care services system, if our system of mental health care in California is falling short, it's not completely for the lack of funding. And the governor and the legislature have definitely tried to respond to the effort to make mental health a top-tier state priority, but some of those efforts have been controversial. Proponents say more bold measures are needed to get more people off the streets and out of our jails and into treatment. But advocates worry that those proposals curtail individual liberties without addressing widespread shortages of housing and community-based services. On this edition of Then There's California, we'll talk about the Newsom administration and the legislature's fresh, prioritized focus on our state's mental health system and what are being considered as strategic, transformative proposals that embrace humane and effective ways of averting or eliminating chronic challenges in our system and also facing the humanity within it. Dr. Susan Talamantes Eggman is from Stockton, representing California's 5th Senate District, which covers the northern part of California's Central Valley. Senator Eggman has a distinguished career as a mental health provider and social worker, and throughout her legislative career, Senator Eggman has authored and guided several complex mental health bills into law. So it is a natural fit that she is the chair of the Senate Budget Subcommittee on Health and Human Services. She's also the vice chair of the legislature's LGBTQ caucus. And for the purposes of this conversation, it is important to note that she is the co-chair of the Senate Mental Health Caucus. And as we all know by now, listening to this podcast, she is a beloved baker of bread. Her honey and the rye loaf is some of the best bread you will ever taste. I know that firsthand. We are glad to have her back with us on the podcast. Senator Eggman, welcome back.
Thank you so much, Brian. It's always great to see you, and what a rousing endorsement of my bread.
Had to bring the bread into this somehow. How are you? How's the valley? How's the family?
Yeah, thanks. I'm doing great. Unfortunately, we are incredibly busy this year, as you can only imagine.
Yes.
We've been running from committee to committee, and it has affected my bread game. I am remiss to admit it, but my bread game is off. But I have discovered I've been making a lot of focaccia, which is also good, and just made with regular yeast and not sourdough. So I'm still doing the sourdough, but I've had to downgrade a little bit to focaccia, which is good too.
Absolutely. Well, I assume once a bread baker, always a bread baker, and
Always.
especially since this was sort of a pandemic muse or hobby, you can pick it up anytime. But yeah, that honey and the rye, you put a lot of corner bread stores to shame with that. It was really delicious. Do you still have your culture?
Oh, no. Yeah, I baked 2 loaves this week, but for a while, I baked, if you recall, when I first started in the Senate, I baked 40 loaves for 40 senators.
You had one going and one rising. Yeah. So the 2 loaves is still pretty impressive, actually. So
for the week, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So that's my goal now, like 2 a week. That's, sensible. My spouse tells me.
Well, that does make sense. After the last couple of years, things are getting crazier. The fact that when would you have time to bake bread and be a full-time legislator? Well, I know actually there have been a lot of changes logistically and otherwise here in the Capitol, which mirror in some ways the challenges facing California. Has 2022 felt like a time of regrouping and a deeper collaboration between you and your colleagues now that you're more in person more often here?
Absolutely, both with my colleagues and I think with our staffs too. Our staff becomes an integral part of our lives, and I always describe them as I can be up on the high wire because I know my safety net is down there, having prepared me and are there standing by. So we all work remote from a Zoom perspective for so long. So it is great to be back. It is interesting. I saw one of the special service officers I didn't even recognize, because the whole time I've known her, she's been wearing a mask.
I have
masks
had that
come off.
For a while. It took me a while to recognize people with masks on,
yes.
And now I can't recognize people with them off.
With the mask
Funny you
on.
should say that.
It makes every day an adventure. You just keep smiling and being pleasant to everybody you pass.
Do I know you?
Yeah. Do I know you? Maybe I know you.
I completely understand that. So that is one of the adjustments. And the pandemic has created its own social, emotional, and economic challenges for Californians. And, of course, the challenges that we faced as a state and a country before the pandemic seemed more chronic in the middle of it, and now we're still facing it. COVID seems to be moving further down the list of headlines, but those pre-pandemic challenges of poverty and social and economic disparity and homelessness and housing shortages, gun violence, our troubled mental health system, it's still there waiting for us to deal with.
Absolutely. I think one of the phenomenons that we're still, it's going to take a while to understand, but I think the pandemic forcing everybody to be home provided a lot of benefits, but I think, and again, this is just me kind of speculating, but I also think it provided a lot of times for people to not talk with people with different ideas in themselves, and people getting kind of more entrenched in their ideologies that sometimes I think will take precedence over just our ability to be kind to one another. And I've noticed an increase in anger. I am someone who commutes, and the amount of road rage you see just every single day, True. I think is interesting. We had a tragic shooting here in Sacramento the other day, yes. But they're happening in Stockton and other riots. But it's just this quick reflex and this anger and this willingness to prioritize your own individual desires to take precedent over just kind of a common good concerns me.
And that even itself exacerbates these challenges.
It exacerbates all the challenges we have, that we're trying to find unity and ways to come together, and we have massive problems to tackle. And it just makes it more complicated to tackle problems if we can't agree on the origins, if we can't agree on the solutions, if we can't agree on their impacts. It makes it challenging. I think we're up for it, but yes. I think it's I don't want to be doom and gloom, but I think it's worth acknowledging, and it's not just something a soundbite is going to take away. It's going to be a lot of work, I think, coming back out and reconnecting with people, and not just people who think exactly like we do, but really trying to find ways to bridge these divides. I mean, there's only one way for us to go forward, and that is together. And
I love here how you are being proactive in bridging the divide and dealing with this chronic, just heartbreaking problem of the mental health care system here in California, and the families that are dealing with it, the clients, the patients that are involved in it. And when we look back at the challenges that we faced in our mental health system over the generations, you commented not too long ago that we knew we had a mental health system at one time that didn't work, and we changed it, you said, but we didn't fix it. And now we have another set of problems. Elaborate on that.
So in 1967, we passed the Lantern-Peters Act, and that is very strict criteria to take people's rights away from them, which, there should be strict criteria. Historically, people were institutionalized, and we thought that was the way to go. Of course, we realized that was wrong, and we needed to do a different way. But as you've also heard me say, I think we've gone way too far in prioritizing the rights of an individual who was unable to make those decisions for themselves. As a social worker, one of our core tenets is the right to self-determination. I'm the author of the Death with Dignity bill, right?
Absolutely,
I mean, that's right. People being able to make their own decisions is core to me and my belief about the world. But I also believe that if people are incapable of being able to make decisions for themselves safely, then it is our responsibility to help them with those things. We had a press conference yesterday, and the mayor said, we know we will love you where you are, but we don't want to leave you there.
And in fact, that helping, that being able to help, being able to step in for somebody, that is it's self-empowering for that individual.
Absolutely, absolutely. And for the families, right? So because for everybody that you see who's struggling massively, there is an entire family behind them that oftentimes has been trying for years to be able to get help for people. And again, the people I'm talking about in the LPS, again, that is somebody who's very much at the end of a lot of things being tried. So I have an 8-bill package this year that really tries to address our entire continuum of care. I think that's where we've failed historically in trying to fix our conservatorship or LPS is that we didn't have the infrastructure in place to look at our entire continuum of care. I think that's what's different this year. In addition to having the billions of dollars that we've been able to have to invest in mental health infrastructure, increase in care, increase in beds, increase in abilities. I think it was 12 years ago, we passed the MHSA, the Mental Health Services Act.
Darrell Steinberg. Who was then Assemblyman, then he was pro tem, and now he's mayor of Sacramento. And I'll never forget Senator Steinberg at the time. We need beds. We got to have beds. And that was the impetus. And of course, it was born from a time when there was no budget. We had these chronic budget shortfalls here in California, and that money was very much needed. Very much needed. And so that's one of the things we're working with the Steinberg Institute. We're doing a redo of the MHSA. And one of those things is really focusing on accountability, transparency, outcomes, because I think while the idea was beds could be provided, I think that happens very seldom using the MHSA money. And when it first started, it looked like it was going to be, maybe $600 million a year. This year, we're looking at perhaps $4 billion. Wow. So the increase in the amount of funding is critical. So what a loss it would be, what a missed opportunity if we didn't really do everything we possibly can right now. We talk a lot about infrastructure, but our mental health infrastructure desperately needs to be repaired in order so that we don't see the crisis that we see on the street every single day. I called 911 on my way in today after I dropped my child off at school. I'm on El Dorado, main roads, trying to turn the march. Somebody had their car pulled over. They were out of their car pouring water on their head while they were taking their clothes off, clearly having some kind of crisis. It's hard to see if were they poisoned in some kind of way or were they having an episode. It's hard to figure out on your way to work. Right. But I am not alone in seeing things every single day that I think this is unacceptable for a civilized society to allow this kind of breakdown and suffering of humanity, because we know for every person that we see on the street that is not getting help, they are victimized, right? And that's what, it is frustrating sometimes with some of the folks who want to focus on civil liberties. Yes, we need to focus on civil liberties when people are capable of making their own decisions. But what we see right now is a crisis of humanity on the street that doesn't just affect the people that are suffering, but it also impacts every single one of us as we see it and have to grapple with our own crisis that we feel when we visualize it, in addition to the communities who want their government to work and want care to be provided in the most humane ways possible. The press conference you had yesterday, you have the mayors of 13 biggest cities, which is encouraging to know that local government really wants the state to step in. But your legislation fixes a few things, streamlines a few things, deals with conservatorship issues. Give us a little more details on this package that you've introduced. Yes, and I will say, as you mentioned before, I am the co-chair of the Mental Health Caucus, and so there's a lot of bills that people are working on, a lot of very important legislation. We have an 8-bill package, and I am very proud that we have the support of the major psychiatric associations in California, providers, as well as the coalition of the 13 big city mayors, because the cities is where you see the issues concentrated most acutely. And, I think it's important to state that while mayors and cities are seen as responsible, it's the counties who are responsible for providing the mental health or behavioral health care. And so I will start by saying one of the bills looks at kind of using a COG format, right? A council of governments, local governments coming together to do regional planning that is already in place for transportation and housing. We want to add addiction and psychiatric beds to that. Absolutely. So that you will get then the city and the counties all together at the same table to talk about expanding the infrastructure from a regional perspective. But a great example in my district between Stanislaus and San Joaquin County, a project going up that has been able to do just that. So to encourage more of that. One of the other things that we talked about most acutely, if you go right now, and I was just, again, in conversation with one of my colleagues, former colleagues, I was a professor at Sac State who currently works in an emergency room in Northern California. So one of the bills will, if you're in a hospital and somebody comes in who needs to be placed, that you would have an online, on-time database that you would know the availability of beds. You can get food delivered, you can take a ride somewhere, but if you are a social worker working in an emergency room, you have still your pad of paper and your phone, and you're calling to see if somebody can accept a client. And then you don't know the criteria. Is it a locked unit? Is it a suicidal person? You don't know any of that. And so we have tried that since 2016, try to do that. We think this is the year it's going to get done, to be able to really streamline these. My friend this morning said she spends 2/3 of her time now trying to find beds for people while these people are
often in an emergency room, not being treated, in a cradle-type bed, which is basically like a padded bed with a webbed top, screaming, with the nurses and the assistants having to come in and try to quiet them down while other people are there. And let's be honest, we are seeing a mass exodus of our healthcare professionals too, because people are exhausted and wanting something different. Our emergency rooms and our jails should not be our biggest mental health service providers.
Right.
So one of the other things we're looking at is updating the LPS. Right now, if you're a danger to yourself, others, or their ability to find food, clothing, and shelter, which means you're actively suicidal, you're actively homicidal. Right now, if somebody goes before to be held against their will, they're like, well, somebody put a plate of food down them when they're on the side of the road, so that counts as the ability to feed themselves. No, we're saying it should be, and most other states do this, the ability to be able to care for yourself physically and maintain your own safety. And we don't understand why people, would think that was against somebody's civil liberties, that we don't want people victimized on the streets, and we see it every single day. And people are, then committing some kind of crime, ending up in our jail system. So again, unacceptable. And then for the conservatorship, really being able to look at what has the history of this person been. Somebody comes before you with a plan like, okay, here's how I'm going to stay out of jail, stay in my housing. But the judge does not have the ability to look back at that medical record and see if that's been the same plan every day for the last 30 years and has never been able to be followed through on. This will be an extra criteria to really be able to redo both the LPS conservatorship to be able to provide for that. We're also going to provide for, there can be a temporary conservatorship to provide an opportunity for an extra time for that. So before someone moves to a conservatorship, they'd have an extra period of time to be able to see if they could regain their abilities enough to not require a higher level of care. We are comprehensive, and again, I can go on forever.
This is incredibly comprehensive.
And at the same time, I think we should, mention the governor's got a proposal for the care court.
Right,
which we think works right alongside our system. So we established this system in 1967, as you heard me say before. The only thing in my house that still works from 1967 is my 1954 Wedgwood oven that I'm still baking bread in. Right? Nothing else is working, just like our mental health system.
Right, exactly. Right. So we expect the 1967, we need to change.
We need to change. So the system we have needs to be repaired. So right now our system is created around crises, basically, if you will. It's a crisis response system at the very end of the road, if you will. Not that everybody who's homeless has a mental health issue. Not that everybody who has a mental health issue is homeless. But there is a nexus between those that is some of the hardest to reach, hardest to serve demographic. And those issues are not always a crisis or acute, but they are often chronic. So with the governor's care court, to me, it's a frontage road, if you will, because it is a on-ramp into a system or into services that is not through the acute, but through the chronic door. Now, that's going to be, complicated to set up, but we are well up for the tasks, and I think it works perfectly hand in hand. We've worked a lot extensively on AOT, or outpatient treatment, and the governor kind of references it as being kind of small ball because as many people who we may want haven't been helped, but that's those just who have been mandated into treatment. There's a larger number who go in voluntarily, which is what you want, but also to be able to include medication as part of that plan. Other states, again, do it. So again, we're not talking about forcing medication, but it being part of a treatment plan. And if someone is not compliant with the treatment plan, then by definition, they move up to a higher level of care.
And I know one key element of the care court is the peer support that gives those with mental health issues who come to care court an ally, a liaison, someone with a lived experience in the mental health and criminal justice system. I would imagine, from your perspective as a social worker and a counselor, peer support is a vital component of this.
Peer support is a vital component of this. We face massive workforce issues right now also, especially in this arena. I don't want to give any illusion that it's going to be easy to set up, but it is vitally important. And that kind of, the stats that's thrown around is somebody who is profoundly living on the streets with a serious and significant mental health issue. It takes at least 40 contacts with that person before you actually can get them into a door. We are throwing money at an issue that isn't helping anybody. So we think this is a much better way to go. That peer support, that really being able to have somebody to hold somebody accountable to go back and check is vitally important. I mean, just things like talking with my DA about being able to maybe have the DMV be a part of that. People just having an ID.
Yes.
You don't even think about it. If you don't have an ID, you can't get services, you can't do anything. And to get somebody like, okay, I'm going to fill out my paperwork. Okay, let's make you an appointment at DMV in a month from now, and then you show up there at that time. I mean, realistically, that's not going to happen. So how do we really find ways to continue to bring the services to people where they are, but don't leave them there, right?
Right.
Being able to bring the services there as a way to lift people up. And the peer support is a vital part of that.
Well, one other element of the proposal is the mandate that counties participate full and completely, and court sanctions against the counties if they don't participate, which has led to a lot of pushback at the local level about how the state expects the counties to implement this without the needed funding. And I know last year's state budget was $12 billion in multi-year funding for homelessness and mental health programs, including children's mental health, which is another especially important issue. And the governor's proposing another $2 billion this year. You're the budget sub-chair. Of course, you know all of this. You've debated this firsthand in Health and Human Services, the budget sub. Is the money there for the counties to fully implement this as mandated by this proposal and law under your name should it pass? And are sanctions like this, or this penalty, is that a way to motivate counties? That's another concern they're having.
There are resources coming in multiple ways. The historic amount that we've sent down, if it is not quite enough, it is certainly enough to get started and then figure out what else we need. Yes, I believe there is enough money. Should we always have more? Absolutely. But sometimes I think the counties, and not through any fault of their own, are hesitant, perhaps, and there's a lot of red tape involved, right? And sometimes it's easier to kind of, not have to struggle with all that, and so projects don't get built. And then you have the issues of NIMBYism. I mean, we have a new home key project going into my area for foster kids, and everyone screams, we have to do this. But you start putting the project up, and then people are like, whoa, 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 not in my neighborhood. So that is something the counties are going to have to push back on in a much more collaborative way. And then hopefully being able to partner with the cities, we can get more of that work done. And again, don't forget, we're also going to see record amounts in the MHSA money, which goes right back to counties.
The timing actually couldn't be better.
Absolutely.
Because I think coming out of the pandemic, what people experienced during the pandemic, everybody has had that experience that you had, seeing that situation at the side of the road, in the street, even in their own families. I think the public considers this a priority.
Absolutely. There is no doubt. You talk to the average person right now, they are not talking about COVID. They are talking about homelessness, what they see on the streets. I mean, it is a public health emergency. There is no way around it. The off-ramp I get off on every single day, I look to my right, and it is a massive, massive, and it's not just, there might be 5 people, but there is so much trash and buildup around that, and it gets bigger every single day.
And you see it here, actually, coming off the freeways into
yes,
downtown Sacramento.
Yes.
You are jockeying, if you will, shepherding the governor's care court proposal through the legislative process as you are your other legislation. You've been a real leader in this process for obvious reasons. You've had the Newsom administration's ear. Has the Newsom administration been upfront with you and earnest and working with you in good faith, taking this seriously, I assume?
Yes, I think they're taking it very seriously. The administration and governor, I think, has really gone full in on both providing that funding and coming up with things like CalAIM, and then coming up with things like the care court. I mean, we're going to have to work in collaboration, and Senator Umberg from the judicial side, and then me on the mental health side.
Well, let's talk about Laura's Law. It became one of California's primary outlets for families being able to get their loved ones into mental health treatment. And, of course, that law was born, as many are, born out of a tragedy in Nevada County where a receptionist was killed by a man who had refused psychiatric treatment. That was a game changer for the system and the families that were affected by it, but it had some loopholes. You came along in the Assembly before you came over to the Senate to fill those loopholes and improve the law. Talk about that legislation and that story.
And God bless them, the Wilcox family, they just retired, and that was one of the last things they wanted to do, was to make sure that we got some of those things fixed. Yeah, so we have expanded Laura's Law. It was just before counties had to opt in order to participate in it. We made it the law so that counties had to opt out, which created a lot more counties opting in to the program, or otherwise having to do a public tell to their communities of why they weren't doing it, and explaining that. We've come back now and talked about the criteria that if you're coming off a conservatorship, you can still go into it, because you may not meet the criteria because you're not currently in crisis. We don't want you to devolve. This year we're going to come back and that's what I said, and talk about medication as a part of that care plan. We think that's vitally important. So again, it's Laura's Law. It's AOT, also referred to as advanced outpatient therapy for people who have proved to be a danger, who have proved to be non-compliant, to have more teeth to be able to bring them into the system.
When we talk about gun violence and mental illness, I don't think it's fair to always find a direct link between gun violence and mental illness. But when gun violence makes headlines, like it has, as you mentioned, in a very serious and sad way in Sacramento, it often elevates the mental health debate with it. And I know Mayor Steinberg even made reference to that and alluded to it during the press conference this week. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's, as you said, Brian, it is, you can't say that mental health issues contribute directly. Is it a part of it? Of course. I think we have all suffered coming through the pandemic in all kinds of ways, but the amount of anger, I think, and the quick reactions that we're seeing from people is an incredibly troubling phenomenon. I'm not going to call it especially a mental health issue, but I think it's more just a humanity issue that we're struggling with right now. But we have seen some pretty alarming behavior from some folks who are homeless and suffering from mental health issues here in Sacramento. A woman was assaulted, another with her children. Another woman was assaulted on the river. And so these things happen as well. And that, unfortunately, there was probably many, many times to intervene with these folks before they actually hurt someone. And then that results in them losing their ability to make their own decisions for themselves, oftentimes forever, because they're going to go into a facility because they weren't treated earlier. We know the fastest way and the most effective way, the most cost-effective way to be able to help somebody is to be able to intervene as early as possible when they're having a mental health issue, which is why we've done a lot for children's mental health, and we'll continue to focus on that. It's not fair just to talk about kind of the conservatorship and the end result without talking about all the resources that we're putting in earlier. And I think what Mayor Steinberg was talking about, kids have been out of school, people have been out of work, everyone's been wearing a mask, and I think the amount of programs that we've been able to have for young people, law enforcement used to get angry with me when I'd say, recreation programs and libraries are crime reduction, right? They are. But those kinds of things that I think we've been detached from, we need to really find ways to get back to those. And I know it's a long slog, but if you don't really engage with people at a younger age, then we're going to be engaging with them at the criminal justice level later on.
And I know local governments actually are starting to take a more holistic approach or shift to how their law enforcement, their local police forces respond to those calls. And in particular, I think San Francisco and a couple of others have deployed police-free response teams, these health crisis teams that go to where typically a law enforcement officer would respond. It's a paramedic, a behavioral health clinician, sometimes a peer counselor that can go out and respond to someone in the throes of a mental health crisis. And this new treatment approach actually is saving lives and saving money ultimately. I assume that's something you would truly support.
Absolutely. And it's, you say new. It's not really new. We've been doing it for a long time and know it works. It's just funding it consistently.
True.
It was probably the late 90s. I had a student who was doing that with the police department, and it was a pilot program. Well, these pilots work every single time. We just have to actually fund the positions. We did some legislation a couple of years ago just to make sure whoever that person is supervised by a licensed clinician. We want to make sure training is a part of that. You don't want to send anybody to a crisis, and you don't just want to take a law enforcement officer and say, okay, now you're the mental health person, and think that's the same thing. It's a different set of skills, but absolutely we support that, and we did money for that through the mobile crisis also. That counties would have the ability to pull that down, mobile crisis units, and we still need to work out some of the details, but the feds have required by July we have our 988 system up, that people will be able to call wherever they are to be able to not get, it'd be like a 911, but to get any other kind of help and for a crisis.
I know as bills come through the legislature, a lot of these pieces of legislation are informed and affected by an individual lawmaker's personal policy priorities or their lived experience and their expertise. And your mental health legislation, I know, is no exception to that. You have talked with me in the past about some of those experiences you've had as a mental health worker and a hospice worker, but I know also healthcare and mental health care have been a key path for you from early on, even starting back in high school. You were working on the front lines, so to speak, and focused on making the mental health community a priority.
Yeah, I was laughing with someone the other day that people think I retire, you come at it from an academic. No, I was working, my very first job where I got paid outside the family was at a psychiatric center. And I can remember, being laid out more than once, getting punched in the stomach and getting the wind knocked out of me, working with somebody, getting folk up for meds. So, and that was, before we had redone a lot of things. But yes, and then I've worked in and around the mental health system the majority of my life. It's always been in and around hospitals, so hospice also work with that, and of course you're dealing with mental health issues there as well. But yeah, it's been a focus for me. I've shared my first partner was hugely bipolar, not when we were together. I mean, she probably was, but ended up committing suicide, which was, horrifying. Her parents tried multiple times to get her into care, couldn't get her into care. The day she shot herself in the head, she said she was getting a haircut. You've heard me talk about my maternal aunt, my dad's only sister, who died with serious mental health issues. A family struggled for years. My cousin was on a KQED television program where she talked about she wasn't sick enough to keep her in the hospital, but she was sick enough to go out and get raped. My aunt ended up getting, gang raped and then developed HIV/AIDS and died from that. But she was in and out. My cousin would say, if you can keep her for 2 weeks, we can stabilize her. But, it was that cycle of in and out and 52 hours, 72 hours, and then back out again. So it has impacted me in my life and in my work. Yes, since the beginning.
But perhaps you could say one of the blessings out of that is that it has informed everything that you're doing now, but it is personal.
Yeah, my cousin, who was the main caregiver, she died last year, God rest her soul, my cousin Debbie. I sent the clips from the press conference yesterday to my other cousin, her sister, who was her caregiver when she died, and said, we're still working on it, because she would tell me all the time, you got to fix it, cousin, you got to fix it. Because she, lived her life as a caregiver for her mom, who saw her die, and then her own health deteriorated. My cousin was only 65, and she died of, of things that people shouldn't die from anymore, but they do. And I think just the trauma of interacting with our system and caring for my aunt, also, I don't think it contributed to her death, but all of this stuff just drains on people, and your kind of capacity to live and to thrive is impacted by your surroundings and the context that you find yourself trying to work in.
Yeah. As a prelude to compassion in life, there's the willingness to see, the willingness to deep dive with family, sometimes even with strangers, and be at their basis of base levels and experience those things. And that can so much inform and affect the compassion moving forward with other people.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. When I was a hospice social worker, I can remember most acutely going in and people were like, oh, honey, I don't need a social worker. We're okay. And I would say, my role is defined by your needs, right? And you may not need me right this minute, but let's build a relationship. Because then when you do, we already know each other, and just kind of being able to engage with people. And I think that's what we're doing, hopefully doing with people on the streets too, just going out. You have to establish engagement first. And you can't engage with people unless they feel seen and heard and respected.
Speaking of engagement, as we close here, I want to pivot vertically, I guess, to the broader mental health issue, how we as a society, as a collection of individuals, are handling life post-pandemic. We all remember mid-March of 2020 when we went into lockdown, offices were getting ready to close. We grabbed a few files and say, we'll be back in a few weeks and see you on Zoom. And
2 years later.
Plus years later, like, oh my gosh. So the tremendous loss, the adjustment socially, economically, medically, spiritually, that's unfolded for all of us in the last couple of years. The majority of us are vaccinated. We're no longer willing to let COVID stop us or let time pass by. But there's a reverb, an echo of this pandemic that still remains in our life, and still like a second pandemic, a mental health issue that we're still all dealing with, even if life seems to appear to normal. What's your perspective on that?
I think you're right on. Every week we have Democratic caucus, and I mentioned that last week in caucus. I just said, hey, we all talk about how much we want to help people with mental health issues and how mental health and increased capacity is a priority for us. But let's think about ourselves too, because we are all struggling with coming back out. We are all struggling with re-engaging, where all of a sudden you think everything's okay, and then you think, oh my God, all these people, right? Does somebody have COVID? And there's these momentary panics, I think, that everybody has. Staff coming back in, they're going to struggle too. So I think part of it's just acknowledging that this is difficult, acknowledging that we all might be feeling some anxiety and unease, being kind to ourselves and being kind to one another. I spoke recently in my daughter's classroom, just kind of politics 101 or government 101, I should say. And on my way out, a young man asked me, Senator, if you could pass one law in the land, and he meant the country, because I was like, the state or the country, what would it be? And I said, well, I don't know if it's a law, but I just would like us all to be kind to each other. And he said, I think that's a good idea.
Absolutely. It's almost like we have a 5 stages of grief here that we still have to go through.
Right.
Here's a kind of odd question, but after 2 years of COVID, from the perspective of a psychologist and a social worker, what does mental health look like? Keeping in mind everything you've said already.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that we see is capacity, right? We are experiencing the Great Resignation, the Great Retirement. I think people in our education system, our healthcare system, our mental health system, law enforcement, the pandemic has been especially hard for those who have had to maintain their work in extraordinary ways. And people say, what are you going to do after you get out of the legislature? Like, maybe I'd like to be the behavioral health workforce czar, because we need to break down every barrier we have to getting folks out into the community to provide the resources. So the kind of status of mental health from a practical sense is that it is very hard to access. If you're in the Medi-Cal system, it is difficult. If you have all the resources you need, it's difficult. So that makes it difficult, like in a traditional sense. But I also think people have found different ways of self-care. And so I think when we think about mental health, you also kind of think about self-care. People, making bread, or if it's gardening, or if it's doing more with their pets. I mean, people have found different and more ways to provide self-care, and I think that's important. But I think mental health will continue to be a challenge for our young people. We're going to see ramifications for this for a long time to come. So one of the things I'd say, anybody listening, if you're interested in a career in behavioral health, now's the time, and there's going to be a lot of incentives and loan forgiveness going forward to be able to get us all at least back to a place where we're kind of set. Yeah.
And luckily, babies are still being born,
art
is still being made. Not to sound corny or cliche, but there's still hope.
Oh, absolutely. That's what I say. My hope too is in all. We have such a bright young people. Yeah. The young people who work for me in our schools, on our streets. The amount of advocacy you're seeing is truly amazing. We're going to be okay. We're going to be okay.
And with that positive note, Senator Eggman, thank you so much for your time. It's always great to talk to you. Good luck with your legislative package here moving forward to the benefit of California and the people that need it. I hope you do get a chance somewhere in here to bake a few extra loaves of bread sooner than later. But I really appreciate you joining us here on Then There's California.
Thank you, Brian.
Dr. Susan Eggman of Stockton, State Senator representing California's 5th Senate District. And that brings us to a close of this edition of Then There's California. We're a production of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus with technical assistance and production support from Martin Ashley, Bob Brulte, Brian Shadden, Rainier Sabiniano, John Roman, McLeana Woods, Lisa Murphy, Blake Cooper, and the graphic artistry of Tim Davis. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. Thanks for listening to Then There's California.